Hello everyone, I'm Kirsten Amanda, and today I'm going to be showing you how you can paint white watercolor cosmos. I'm using 3 brushes for this painting, a size 5, size 4, and size 3, and although I didn't show it here, you'll see I actually decided to add a smaller size 1 brush later on. If you'd like the link to the sketch, I've provided the link in the description box below. I'm starting off with a size 5 brush, and I'm getting this nice and wet and full of water before we start mixing our paints. I'm going straight into this burnt sienna and finding a spot to mix on my palette. I'm not too concerned if there's other paint in it because we are creating a gray color, it doesn't matter too much. I'm adding a bit of ultramarine blue to the burnt sienna, creating this warm gray color. You want to make sure this mixture is nice and watery so that the paint is nice and translucent and doesn't dry too quickly. Once you have your color mixed, you'll want to start by adding definition between the petals by adding gray to create shadow to the petals sitting beneath the other ones, and then I'm also adding lines to the petals to create ruffles that cosmos naturally have. I'm not overthinking these lines too much, and I'm intentionally not making them perfect. After I have the shadows and lines down, I am taking a size 4 brush and getting the bristles nice and wet and then dabbing off any excess water on my towel so that the brush is damp. I'm using a clean, damp brush to blend out the color that I just laid down. You'll want to make sure that you aren't dragging the paint around too much so that you still have some white spaces on the petal. The intention here is to add shadows and definition and ensure that the petal stands out on the white paper, but we want to make sure that we aren't just making gray petals by having too much paint or by dragging the gray onto the white spaces. I'm moving to the petal beneath this one and adding the shadow directly where they would overlap. It may help to look at a reference photo of some white cosmos and just examine where the shadows are and how the ruffles look. One thing to keep in mind when painting your lines is the direction of the petal. Make sure you are following the natural direction of each petal. Again, I am taking my damp brush and blending very carefully, just enough to soften the lines. If you have too much water on the brush you're using for blending, you will notice your paint start to bloom over the entirety of the petal, and we want to avoid this to ensure we are keeping the integrity of the white of the page in some spots. Next, I'm coming down to this lower petal to avoid painting near another petal that is already wet, as we don't want the paint to bleed from one petal to another. As you can see, this petal is tucked beside the one to the left of it, so I've created a shadow, and then I'm painting the lines towards me as this is the way the petal is facing. You can see that I'm sort of curving the lines in a soft C shape instead of straight. This will make the petals look much more curved and natural. Make sure that your gray mixture is staying nice and watery so that the paint doesn't dry on you before you have the chance to blend it. As you can see, for these petals that sit on top of others and are not shadowed behind another petal, I'm making them a bit lighter. Again, when looking at a reference photo of white cosmos, you will see that the petals on top are a brighter white than those that are farther back and below the petals above them. As I'm blending the gray out, I'm making sure to rinse my damp brush often so that it stays clean. Your brush can act as a sponge for watercolor and pick up the paint that you lay down, so you want to make sure that if you're using this technique, that you keep the brush nice and clean to avoid getting paint in areas that you don't want it. I find that these Kolinsky sable brushes are great for blending as they're really soft. If you're using a fully synthetic brush, just be cautious as it can be harder to blend the lines softly without making the lines look too harsh. If you're on a budget or can't access these particular brushes, I really recommend the Oasis brushes. I have them linked in the description box below. These are a blend of Kolinsky sable and synthetic gold sable. They act very similar to the Winsor & Newton Series 7 Kolinsky brushes and will help you get that soft blend we are trying to achieve here. I'm just finishing off the last petal on this upper flower, and then I'm using the exact same technique on the other flowers, including this smaller one that is facing away. Again, just shadowing between the petals and creating ruffles with lines of paint and blending them out. Now I'm just taking that same mixture and adding some shadows at the base of this bud to start and blending it out. I'm going to let that dry completely before I add some more details to it, so I'm just grabbing a size 1 brush and working on this blooming bud up top. I'm grabbing some paint and I'm going to shadow in between each of these blooming petals using the same technique of dropping down paint and blending it out. Once again, make sure that you are not working on any petals directly beside each other while they are still wet, as we don't want them to bleed together. Coming back down to this other bud, I decided to add some lines to make it look like it's opening up, and I'm just softly blending those out. Next, we're going to work on the foliage of the cosmos. I'm using yellow ochre and ultramarine blue to create this very soft, low-intensity green color. You can play around with this mixture to get a color you like. If you add more yellow, it will be brighter and warm, and if you add more blue, it will be darker and cooler. I used about a 50-50 ratio of ultramarine and yellow ochre here. Now I'm taking the tip of my size 3 brush to start loosely following my pencil lines for the stems and these lower leaves. If you feel more comfortable with using a size 1 brush, go ahead. This is all personal preference. I'm making sure my brush is full of paint here so it can go a long way with filling the greenery evenly. I'm going to use this color as a first wash over all of the leaves and stems. After you have painted all of the foliage, we can hop back to our flowers to add some details. I'm taking some burnt umber and mixing it with the gray to dull it down a bit. You'll want to make sure this mixture is pretty watery so we can easily blend it. Now I'm taking the size 5 brush and popping a bit of this color on the ends of the petals to really define the difference between where the petals end and where the white of the paper starts. I really enjoy including both warm and cool tones in all of my florals, so adding a bit of this warm brown color helps bring some interest to the cool toned petals. I'm taking my size 4 brush to blend this out, concentrating it to the ends of the petals. As you can see, I'm not drawing a perfect line at the end of each petal, but rather adding little moments of brown. This will help give us illusion without having to define every detail of the petals. I find the process and steps of painting florals overall to be pretty repetitive, which is exactly what I love about it. I find it extremely grounding and meditative to paint this way. That said, as you may have guessed, I'm going to repeat this process on the rest of the petals on all of the flowers. We want this to be a subtle defining detail, so make sure as you're painting all the petals that you're keeping that brown color nice and activated with water to avoid any harsh lines. After that is complete, we are going to use our eraser to erase all of the pencil markings. I like to add this step mid-painting for a couple reasons. One is so that we're not relying on the pencil markings to define any elements in the painting, and the other is so that we don't lock in the pencil with paint, making it harder to erase later on. Now I'm adding some ultramarine blue into that mixture to bring it back to gray, and I'm going back to the petals to add even further definition and shadow between them. This is a repeat of the first step we did, but we are not adding any additional ruffles. We are just deepening the shadows to bring a greater contrast between petals now that those pencil markings are gone. Again, I'm laying down the gray with one brush and blending it out with a clean damp brush. As you can see, this is really bringing the petals to life. I did end up adding a couple of lines where I felt the petal could use a bit more definition of the ruffles, but nothing crazy. Be intuitive with this process as you go through another layer of the flowers. If you see edges that could use some more defining, you can do that in this step as well. This is the last pass at the petals themselves, so just make sure you feel they get to a place where they are nicely defined and lively. For the stamen, I'm mixing this yellow ochre with cadmium yellow just to dull down the brightness of the yellow. I have a bunch of paint in my size 5 brush and I'm going to start stippling this into the center of the flower. I'm not doing this in a perfect circle. As you can see, some of the stippled yellow paint is outside of the circle. Now with that same wet brush, I am dipping into a bit of burnt umber and using this wet on wet technique dropping it straight into the yellow before it has time to dry. Now I'm just rinsing out my brush and blending the edges of the stamen so that there are no harsh lines. I'm then going to repeat this exact same step on the 2 other stamen. Coming back over to this gray mixture, I'm activating it with some water and using my size 1 brush to further define these 2 buds. I'm just going over the same lines that I had previously laid down to darken the value of the gray and create some deeper shadows. Coming back to the stamen, I'm going to grab my size 1 brush and mix some burnt umber and Payne's gray to create a really nice dark brown color. This time we want the mixture to have less water than usual so that we can control exactly where the paint goes. So taking the tip of this brush, I'm just dotting on some of these pollen seeds over the stamen, focusing this color to the outer perimeter. Next, I'm grabbing a pure mixture of yellow ochre and dotting it in the center of the stamen. I'm repeating this step on all 3 stamen. Lastly, we are going to finish the details of the foliage by using the same color that we used for the first wash, but less water so that the paint is more concentrated. This will create a deeper color for us to use to add shadows and definition to the stems and leaves. I'm using my size 1 brush to concentrate this paint directly under each flower for shadow, and then to one side of the stem or leaves to create some definition. I'm using my clean, damp, size 3 brush to blend out the lines so that they aren't harsh, but I'm not blending them too much as I really like the way the deep contrast looks. You may have to turn your page to get the angles you need to, as we're working in a really small area and I find it's sometimes easier. When you're adding this layer, make sure to keep in mind which stems are behind and which stems are in front. Another thing to keep in mind is that the stem that is farther back will be more likely to have a darker shadow than the stems in front. When adding detail to the leaves, I'm adding the darker pigment on one side and either leaving it as is or softly blending it. Later, as I go into the leaves that are hugging these buds, I'm using the same technique but blending out just a bit more to create a nice gradients. I repeat this step to all the leaves and the stems, and then we are finished. I hope you enjoyed learning how to paint these white watercolor cosmos with me. Make sure to subscribe for more videos like this, and as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you in my next video.